Welcome to Rail Riding Time. This time I'd like to tell you about a railway that was small, convenient, sometimes under-engineered, sometimes overly confident, and yet despite it all, it was remarkably successful for a while. This is the story of the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway, a railway that was born on whiskey, coal, geography and the stubbornness of the entire peninsula to remain flat. We're here in Kintyre in Argyll, Scotland. Campbeltown is at the southern end of the peninsula and a few miles away is Machrihanish. If you've ever looked at a map of Scotland and you've seen that bit sticking out from the west into the Atlantic, this is where we are. Transport there has never been easy, which as it turns out is quite important to the story of the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway. So why did they need a railway there? Coal. Simple as that. Coal had been mined in the area since about 1498. Probably before that, however, the records get a bit vague, so we don't really know. Now this is not good coal. There is much better out there. Definitely not top quality, but it has two extremely important qualities. First, there's plenty of it. Secondly, it burnt well enough to keep the whisky distilleries going in the local area, and around this time there was about 20 of them to keep fed, plus to keep the people warm themselves. So if you want to keep the people happy, we keep the coal coming so we can keep the whisky going. So we need lots of it, delivered reliably. The first attempt to move this coal in bulk was by use of a canal. In 1773 it was surveyed, and by 1791 it had been built. At this point roads were unreliable, they were wet and they weren't very well laid. Inland waterways and the boats using them was the best way to move bulk and lots of it reliably and at some pace, fairly quick, certainly quicker than roads were. Unfortunately the canal never really prospered. It was too slow to keep up with the distilleries properly, and it was expensive to maintain. So over the years nature was allowed to aggressively recapture it. By 1856 the canal had been abandoned, but the coal still needed moving. How was that going to happen? By the 1870s railways had expanded across Britain and even across the world. The coal owners in the area knew their coal still needed to be moved, and they looked to the railways to do the job for them. So by 1876 the first railway had been laid. It was only a light industrial railway at this time, only about 4.5 miles long, and run from the pit at Kilcaven down to Campbeltown itself. It was built on a gauge of 2 foot 3 inches, which is still pretty narrow even by narrow gauge standards. And in an ironic turn of fate, they made exactly the same mistake as they did with the canal. They didn't actually take it down to the wharf at Campbeltown. The track itself and the track bed was built economically, which is probably a nice polite way of saying that it was built on the cheap. All they did, they got flat bottom rails and then just spiked them straight down to the wooden sleepers, and even the sleepers were spread out a bit too far. This worked quite well though, right up until one point. As soon as they put a locomotive over the top of it, this is where things started going wrong for the track bed. So the first engine purchased was a little 040 tank called Pioneer, and it immediately demonstrated the point that was brought up earlier. As it went on there, it buckled the rails, the joints where the rails were attached to each other began to bend and split, and things got even worse when they bought a larger engine, Chevalier, which arrived and just started breaking the track itself. Their solution was to modify the locomotives themselves by adding trailing axles, hoping this would spread the weight over the rails, but it still did exactly the same thing. Something needed to be done, and that thing that needed to be done was put better rails down. Once the railway company had sorted out the rails and the trains could run across it fine, it really started doing its job, moving coal. We had about 8,000 residents to fulfill, plus the distilleries already mentioned. They were moving around about 600 tonnes of coal a week on the little railway. The demand was naturally peaked in winter, when everyone needed the coal to keep themselves warm and all that good stuff. They still had some trade in summer, but it was very little. So this is no good for a railway. They need income coming in all through the year. However, tide was about to help them out. By the turn of the 20th century, there was something new in the docks at Campbeltown: steamships. They themselves weren't particularly unusual. However, these steamships carried passengers. They started bringing tourists to Campbeltown itself and around the entire peninsula. They came for the beaches, the scenery, and because we're in Scotland, they came for the Gulf. This was an opportunity for the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway, or not the Machrihanish Railway yet, because we just went to the pits, but this was an opportunity to expand, to get the passengers to keep them going through the summer, while the coal kept them going through the winter. So in preparation for this, a new railway company was formed, the Argyll Railway Company. It was made up of the Galloway family, local mine owners, other interested residents, and the shipbuilders themselves. In short, anyone with an interest in making sure the railway ran further and kept going were involved in this. They applied under using the Light Railways Act to extend the line from Campbeltown right the way to Machrihanish to allow the passengers to really see the Argyll Peninsula. The Light Railways Act was specially designed, as we've seen in other videos, to make it easier for local railways. They didn't have the same sort of restrictions, so they could build it cheaper and quicker, and this was good for them, so they could expand it sooner. It also allowed them to use both steam and electric propulsion. As we saw with the Swansea Mumbles, this was very good, because if they did develop, as it turned out they didn't manage to get that far, but if they did develop, they could just build the electric and get going, so it gave them that scope to run it. Before it could be approved, a route needed to be surveyed, and T.L. Galloway, a local mine engineer, was the man that would take this role on. However, he wasn't openly welcomed in all areas along the route, and he was actually ejected from land and then charged with trespass. Unfortunately for the person that kicked him off the land, trespass at the time wasn't actually illegal within Scotland. So it was dropped, especially when Mr. Galloway himself turned round and threatened to countersue the person for assault. This meant that he could carry on looking at the route, ready to get the railway set up. There was also other opposition to the railway that came about, and this came from a different field. During this time, just like today where we have memes on Facebook and TikTok and various places like that, which tend to sway people's opinion one way or the other. But the 18th century version of that, the 19th century version of that, and the early 20th century version of that was postcards, particularly by a gentleman named Cynicus, whose role was to have a cynical look at life, or that's what he felt his role was. And as we discovered before in other railways, these got produced, but it looks like they would just generically produce cards. So someone had the bright idea of taking one of these generically produced cards and writing the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Light Railway on there, saying this is what the railway would be like, and it would be an absolute terrible thing. Construction on the expansion of the railway started in 1905. The line generally followed the line of the old railway, but there were some slight amendments. They went round hills as necessary, and they opened up some of the bends. It's fine for the coal to go around, it doesn't tend to get frightened, but the passengers might well do. So they decided to make it nice and easy for them. Now, the company had been given powers for compulsory purchase if necessary. However, there were certain stipulations on that. One of the stipulations was that they couldn't actually compulsorily purchase more than 9 houses that were owned by the labouring classes. So knowing this, you can probably imagine the legal wrangling that might have gone on from some of the more well-off families just to try and make sure their house wasn't purchased if necessary. One particularly unusual problem they had was the fact that the railway line had to go through a firing range. And Colonel Druitt, obviously concerned with safety as he was going to sign off the railway, said that a system had to be in place to make sure things remained safe. So they came up with a rather simple solution. When there was firing on, a red flag was raised, much like they do on Salisbury Plain and other training areas around Britain with the army. If that flag was raised, the train would stop. The loco crew would then inform the range control what was going on, how long it had taken us on, and firing would then cease. They'd get back in the train and go through the firing range, and once the train had passed through, they could then recommence firing. There's no reports of anyone having to suddenly duck for cover while passing through the firing range, so I'm presuming that it worked quite well. The railway officially opened on the 25th of August 1906, and as is the standard at this time, the greater good of Campbeltown and Machrihanish all turned out to cheer on the new railway. Within the first 3 weeks it carried 10,000 passengers. This is an enormous number for such a small railway. Horse-drawn traffic in Campbeltown was long distance type, stopped almost immediately. The railway had arrived and it was proven very popular. Along the line there was a few stations, but most of them didn't involve having platforms or even ticket offices. This was felt that it wasn't necessary. Machrihanish, on the other hand, was rather special, and it did have a platform and a ticket office. It was a shed with an iron roof, but that's all that they needed at the time. So considering there was no ticket office, how on earth did they sell the tickets in the first place? Well, this is where they came up with another brilliant idea. They sold tickets on the trains themselves, and they also employed young ladies to sell these tickets. This is presumably so there will be fewer arguments about how much it cost or whatever, or possibly because, knowing how women like to talk to each other, that if there was any trouble, by the time they got to their destination, the person's mother or wife would already know about it and they could sort it out. Either way, the system worked and there was no problems whatsoever with it. The timetable was kept simple. There was 3 return services every day during the weekdays, 6 on a Saturday, and there was none on Sunday, for it was a day of rest. However, there were special trains ran on as well. There were ones that linked to the timers of steamships, so that they could get their main source of income, especially during the summer. There were also ones connected to school timings. And on a Saturday night, because we know people enjoy a drink, especially a wee dram, they ran a late service on a Saturday evening so people could get home after the pub. However, not everyone caught that train, but they came up with some ingenious ways to make sure they got back. There's tales of people coming into the yard after the last train's gone and grabbing the workman's trolley, hand pumping it all the way up to the top of the hill coming out of Campbeltown, and then just letting it roll back down the hill to take them pretty far along the line, which would mean they can get home a bit quicker. Health and safety in those days isn't really what it is today. Speaking of health and safety, the way they dealt with hills, particularly on the goods trains, was a fairly rudimentary affair as well. On the carriages it was fine, they all contained vacuum brakes as was specified in the Board of Trade's agreement and under law at that time within the railways, but the coal wagons didn't get the same legislation. So what they'd have to do is, as they came up to the top of the hill, they'd stop the locomotive, one man would get off the footplate, go down and apply the brakes on certain numbers of the wagons. That way when they went down the hill, they would hold the train back and stop it from overrunning. Board of Trade weren't exactly happy when they heard that this was the method. Quite possibly because there was one incident when the footplateman and the driver were going along the line one day, and being a Saturday they were discussing the pros and cons of the local teams and not agreeing. They weren't agreeing so much that when they got to the top of the hill and it started to come down, they'd forgotten to set the brakes. To his credit, the guardsman tried to get off and start resetting the brakes before it picked up too much speed, and the driver did try to slow it down using the train, but it was too late and the weight of the train started pushing it down the hill. Fortunately, no one was killed and there was no real damage, but it was a heads up on the possible dangers. So the Board of Trade decided that they needed to intervene on this. What they stipulated was that the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway should make sure that they have a brake van. That way it can have a guard at the end, and this would help slow it all down. And they seemed satisfied with this request, especially since the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway themselves turned around and agreed to it and bought one brake van. Didn't seem to worry the Board of Trade for some reason, the fact that they only bought one brake van, but they ran 7 to 8 coal trains a day. Don't know how that one worked out. As it turned out, the brake van was tried and it proved to be so heavy that the locos themselves couldn't haul a full train up the hill. So it was taken to Machrihanish train station, where it was put in the siding and left to rot. In fact, there is a story that they found it while clearing it out when the railway closed down much later. During the 1920s, there were innovations to try and keep the railway going and the local mining with it. They proposed making gas from the coal, petrol from the coal. But like many of these things, great impressive figures were released, however nothing actually ever turned up. Eventually the pit of Kilcaven was closed down and the company that was formed vanished without a trace. The railway managed to stumble on for another few years. In 1932, passenger services ended. A liquidator was appointed in 1933, and by May 1934 the last trains ran. The last job for the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway, ironically, was to carry the kit for its own destruction. It carried all the equipment that was going to be used to dismantle itself, and then brought it back towards Campbeltown bit by bit as it was destroyed. 6 coaches survived this though. They were sold as holiday homes in the area, and they remained recognisably as carriages right up until the mid-1950s. However, time and tide, as usual, does its job, and eventually everything was rotted down apart from the metal that was just a load of rust. So what was the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway? Well, it was under-engineered at times. It was imperfect like most of these railways, but it worked. For 30 years nearly, it made sure that the people could travel where they needed to. It brought tourism to the entire peninsula. It carried coal to keep the distilleries going, to be sold on, to keep money coming into the area. As it turned out, technology had overran it, and the change in the circumstances meant the coal wasn't desirable anymore. But it was there. Without it being there in the first place, would the motor buses have come to the entire peninsula? We don't know. Would the mines have closed down earlier? Highly possible. So even though it didn't last very long, the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway was vital for that area of the country, and possibly why it's still a good area and a popular area for tourism even today. If you've enjoyed this tale of the Campbeltown and Machrihanish Railway, remember to support the channel, like, subscribe, share, let other people know about this, delve into the less well documented areas of the railway history. Until next time, let the tracks of time take you on a voyage of discovery, and we'll see where we're going to end up next time on Rail Ride in Time.